And friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 1, verses 29 through 39. As soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases, and cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." He answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. Well, tonight there's a big football game on TV, and I will be watching. And one of the things that I always thought was one of the best innovations when it came to broadcasting football was the telestrator. And I love watching the commentators talk about plays, and they draw their circles and their lines, and they show you exactly where everyone was supposed to go and what everyone did in order to make a play happen. See, it's one of the things that's really cool about football, in that virtually every player is actually involved in some way in every play. And what they do or don't do, even if it's away from the ball, has a bearing on whether the play is going to be successful. Every player has a role, and every player knows what their role is supposed to be. But they play that role in a larger purpose. And of course, tonight, the larger purpose is to beat Tom Brady. Now, it's to win the game, of course. And so what we have is people who understand the part that they play among 90 players between both teams in order to try and win the game. Now, our story this week is really a story about roles and purpose. And in the story, it begins with Simon, who's Peter. Remember, I keep mentioning he gets renamed later in the story. Peter's mother-in-law is sick. And so they get Jesus and they say, Peter's mother-in-law is sick. She's very near and dear to him. And so Jesus goes over to the house and he takes her by the hand and he heals her. But then it's kind of interesting what happens next. It says that when the fever left her, she began to serve them. And I always had this image, of the person who just got out of their sick bed suddenly making dinner for everyone. And that may not seem like the greatest example through a modern lens, but we kind of have to look at these stories through the lens of history and understand that in that time, while she did not have the full range of roles available to her that we would hope, and in fact, in that time, the church was actually a place that greatly expanded the roles of women. It put women in many positions of leadership, sadly, not all, but it put women in many positions of leadership in a way that was actually uncommon in that society. But in this moment, at that time, she took on the role of being the lead woman in the household, and there were guests over, and so she began to serve them. And this is one of the things that we need to understand, is that each of us has both a purpose and a role that we play toward that purpose. Okay? We have a function, we have a role, there are things that we do, but purpose is what makes that function important. Without a purpose, the function becomes meaningless. And function can actually change over time as needs change, or as our own skills change, or even as, we can grow older and maybe not be able to do what we used to do, or we grow older and we've learned to do things that we couldn't do before. Either way, our function can change over time, but we still have a purpose, and that purpose remains. And the risk that we face in our lives is when we get to a place where our purpose and our role begin to diverge. You see, the role and the purpose that we have, the role we play and the purpose we put the role toward, can get out of sync. And it can happen in a couple of different ways. One of the ways, of course, is when we become unhappy with our role because somehow we don't think the role is worthy of us. For example, you can play a behind-the-scenes role, and it can get tiring when everyone else seems to get the recognition, and that certainly happens in churches. There are so many of you involved in this church who probably don't get the recognition that you ought to get. And I'm certainly sorry when that happens. I wish it wouldn't. I wish there were a way for us to just properly recognize everyone to the extent of that they deserve, because your contributions, the way you contribute toward the ministry in the things that you do, the gifts and skills that you bring, are what make us able to do what we're able to do. And so many of you do it without recognition and without complaint. But sometimes that gets a little tiring, and I get that. I understand that. I sympathize with that. On the other side, you can also get people who are so enamored of the role that they play that they want to keep playing the role even when the role is no longer really helping the purpose. Okay, so sometimes you just learn to do a thing, and that thing is valuable. It advances the purpose for a time, and then there's a time when that role is no longer actually contributing to the purpose. And yet you want to continue to play that role because it's something you know, and it's something that you're good at. And yet continuing in the role can actually get in the way of the larger purpose happening. And we're seeing a little bit of that happen in this story. Because what happens is that Jesus, in the moment, was healing. In that moment, he was healing, and he was drawing attention to his ministry. He's making a name for himself. And then suddenly everyone shows up. Everyone wants to be healed. There is so much healing that needs to happen. It says that all who were sick or possessed with demons came to the house, and the whole city was gathered around the door. If Jesus had just wanted to stay in that role, he could have stayed in that role and been a hero forever. He could have stayed right there, and day after day after day, from further and further away, people would have brought their sick, and Jesus would have healed them, and he would have been loved by all. But that would have meant that he wouldn't have gone on to fulfill his purpose. He wouldn't have gone on to be crucified. And where would we be if that hadn't happened? Where would we be if salvation were not possible by what Jesus went on to do? He could have been lauded. He could have been a hero staying right there. But he had something greater that he needed to do. And business author Jim Collins likes to say this. He likes to say that good is the enemy of great. Right? What he means by that is so often we settle for good. There's nothing wrong with healing people. Healing people is wonderful. It's a noble task. But sometimes we settle for what is good instead of moving on to what is great, moving beyond the good to the great. Now, when it comes to these comparisons and using the word enemy, I'm sure that you've probably also heard a different saying that maybe sounds like the opposite of this saying. And that's when someone says that perfect is the enemy of the good. And what they mean by that is that sometimes people strive for perfection and they don't do what they could do at the level of good because they're not able to do it at the level of perfect. And actually, both of those sayings are true. Good is the enemy of great, and perfect is the enemy of the good. One thing that'll tell you is that greatness and perfection are two different things. And another thing that both of those sayings bring out is the idea that both of them can be excuses to do less than you could have done. When good is the enemy of great, you settle for good rather than moving on to great. When perfect is the enemy of the good, you fail to do the good because you weren't able to do perfect. They're both excuses to do less. And what Christ wants is for us to do more, for us to do what we're capable of doing. And so Jesus goes off to pray. And it says that the people, the disciples, Simon, Peter, and his companions hunted for him. And that word hunted actually has kind of an adversarial connotation. I mean, you can go look for someone, but for instance, if you are, somewhere out in public with your child and your child is lost and you are looking for the child, that's not just looking for the child. There's a certain tension there. There's a certain almost anger there, stress there, because the child is lost, has lost contact with you. And here, when it says that Simon and his companions hunted for Jesus, there's a hint in that text of annoyance. There's a hint in that text of Jesus, where did you go? All these people want you, and where did you go? Where did you run away to? But where Jesus went was where he needed to be to pray, because what he needed to do in that moment was reconnect. He needed to reconnect in prayer. And in that prayer, I think he reconnected with his purpose. He was able to get away and stop being distracted by the crowds and connect to the purpose that he was sent here with. See, the world around us is full of distractions from our purpose. When we want to proceed toward the purpose that we have in life, there are so many things that will distract us. And sometimes what we need to do is pull away for a moment, get away from the distractions so that we can become more aware of the distractions. Sometimes it is in pulling away that we come and get a clearer picture of what our purpose actually is. And then we become aware of what was a distraction versus the things that help us move toward our purpose, and we deal with them appropriately. And after this time of prayer, Jesus says to his disciples, we need to move. We need to go on to the neighboring towns so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do. See, he needs to move on because he was off course from his purpose. He was doing something good and he was doing something needed, but it had pulled him away from his purpose. The purpose was bigger from the task that was there in the town, and he needed to move toward it. And that's one of the things that we need to remember to do. We need to remember to always be present to our purpose. And by being present to our purpose, I mean we always need to be aware of it. We need to be aware of what our purpose actually is. That doesn't mean that we're 24/7 focused on it, because look at Jesus. He did in fact do other things. He did in fact do the healing that he did. He healed many. He just didn't stay there, all right? He did many things, and along the way in the story, he will do many other things. And then at each point where people want him to stay and continue to do that thing that he was doing, he knows how to stop. He knows how to stop and refocus because he was continually present to his purpose, present to knowing what it is that he was supposed to be doing. And so he would do the things that people needed in front of him at the moment until it got to the point that those things were pulling him away from his purpose. And then he knew to refocus and keep moving toward his purpose. For you and me, we need to be present to our purpose so that we know when things are pulling us away from it, when we know that things are maybe diverging, that maybe our role is diverging from our purpose, and maybe we need to take on a different role in order to stay on our purpose. Or maybe, we need to just withdraw from doing the things that are distracting us from our purpose. We have to keep an eye on that in our lives. We have to continually be present to our purpose, knowing the difference between the distraction and the thing that is actually moving us along the right path, so that we can stay focused on the purpose with which we were created. Amen.